Philadelphia is important. The tunnels are very important, critical, strategic in order to stop Hamas from coming back, and Israel needs to deal with it. But I think that pitting hostages versus Philadelphia in a very narrow, short-term perspective is dishonest, misleading, and quite cruel, because what it does is that it makes the chances for getting hostages back very slim.
These last few days have been brutal in Israel. Today, we turn to one of State of Tel Aviv's good friends and regular guests, former IDF spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, the awesome Jonathan Conricus, to discuss the never-ending crisis in which Israel is mired. Late last week, 6 hostages who had survived 11 months of savagery, torture, and extreme deprivation were murdered with at least one bullet to the back of the head at close range. They were forced to record scripted statements by Hamas, which are being released clip by clip to maximize the agony of the families and the nation. Psychological torture, it is called. PSYOPs, it is called in the intelligence and military world. Psychological operations. The goal of PSYOPs is to exploit the emotional vulnerabilities of the enemy in order to gain a military advantage. Hamas has demonstrated over time they are quite skilled in the art of PSYOPs. In this past week, Israeli morale has been battered. Why? Hostages. The majority of the population believes that Hamas should not survive intact, militarily or politically, on Israel's border, ideally anywhere. The majority also believes that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu should no longer be in power. Why? Because of the hostages. That they were ever taken, that October 7th ever happened. That the same men remain in key positions of power, and that the hostages remain in Hamas dungeons. Is another hostage deal possible? Perhaps. Perhaps not. But what we know today is that the impasse to any deal is apparently the matter of the Philadelphi Corridor, a strip of land running approximately 9 miles or 14 kilometers long and 300 feet or 100 meters wide. The Philadelphi Corridor separates the Gaza Strip and Egypt. Passing underneath the corridor are dozens of tunnels, many of which have been destroyed by the IDF in recent months. Some of those tunnels are very large and very wide, allowing trucks to pass through. And it is through these tunnels that Hamas has been supplied with weapons for years, under the watchful eye of the Egyptian military. The negotiation impasse? Hamas insists that Israel must withdraw fully from the corridor. The Israeli government insists that it will not do so. Perhaps, who knows, but perhaps, if Prime Minister Netanyahu was to say, fine, Israel will withdraw fully from the corridor for a defined period of time, and Hamas will release all hostages, not 2 or 3 or 10 or 30, all hostages, dead and alive. Then we've got a deal. Well, wouldn't that be great? But that outcome is actually a total pipe dream. So we revert to reality and the position in which we have been stuck now since late May. What's that? Based on public information, Hamas has indicated it will only release up to 30 hostages in an initial phase of any deal. But Israel must withdraw from the corridor for 42 days. Okay, so let's try this then. How about Israel will withdraw 42 days, 30 living hostages will be released. Why not try? Why? This is why more than 500,000 people took to the streets on Sunday night throughout Israel. Because those hostages could be them, or their children, or parents, or grandparents, or grandchildren. And every Israeli must believe that the IDF and government will do everything possible to bring them home, to honor the founding ethos of the nation. And if Hamas will not agree, well, then there is no choice but to continue to fight. Candidly, I do not believe Hamas will accept those terms. But that does not mean that Israel should not try. Hamas is ISIS. When ISIS tormented hostages before murdering them and broadcast that to the world, outrage was the uniform response. Outrage directed at ISIS. But when the Israeli hostages were tormented and slaughtered, the world blamed Israel, not Hamas, not its financial benefactor, Qatar, not Egypt, which has facilitated Hamas's military machine. The world blamed Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu for their murders. Reality check. Hamas began this war. Hamas thugs shot bullets in the back of the head of each one of the 6 hostages at close range. Their lifeless bodies were found by the IDF on Saturday afternoon. They had been murdered 24 to 72 hours before that time. By Sunday morning, the IDF confirmed their deaths and identities. They were laid to rest on Sunday and Monday. Did Carmel, Eden, Hirsch, Ori, Almog, and Alexander, did they die because Israel refused to agree to withdraw from the Philadelphi Corridor? Jonathan Conricus and I discussed this unbearable development, the intensifying psyops, and why everything in Israel seems to be so excruciating. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and these days hiding out in cottage country Canada, following these distressing developments from afar, but feeling very much like I'm in the thick of it, in the state of Tel Aviv. Stay with us. Hello, Jonathan Conricus, 9:30-ish at night, Tuesday night in Israel. It's been a very tough few days. What's the mood like there?
Hi, Vivian. I'd agree that it's been tough days, very charged days, emotional days, tumultuous days in terms of feelings. The funeral proceedings yesterday were, I think, excruciating is the word that I would say. Like so many others, I watched part of the Hirsch Goldberg Poland funeral and was again blown away by the noble nature of that family. Even in their darkest time of sorrow, they remain so composed, senseful, I would say even positive. Many of their messages were positive and really inspirational. But then, you see other things. You see violence on the streets. You hear our politicians speak, some of them, and you see what I interpret as a lack of leadership and lack of concern for so many parts of Israel, parts of the population, areas, geographical areas, and constituents, that it's quite worrying. And I'm also, of course, very concerned with how effective Hamas's psychological warfare has been and is. I think that they're really, sadly, playing on the chords of the feelings of Israelis and manipulating feelings quite effectively to their benefit. And most of all, in the summary of all this, having heard the Prime Minister or listened to the Prime Minister yesterday in a very rare performance in front of cameras and in front of journalists, where there were actual questions being asked and some actual answers being given, which is such a rare occurrence in Israel these days, except for, of course, Dover Tzahal, the IDF spokesperson. But having seen that, then my main takeaway is from that if it's up to the current government's policies and priorities, the chances of getting live hostages back they're not very good, unless the prime minister's speech was part of negotiations and a way of signaling to Hamas and Yahya Sinwar that he's not going to get Israeli forces evacuated out of Philadelphia, and therefore he shouldn't even try, and he should reach an agreement. But all in all, yes, as you said, challenging days, lots of sorrow for many Israelis, lots of worry. Israelis are still evacuated from their homes. The southern part of Israel has not yet been rebuilt. Northern Israel, the extreme north, is inaccessible. Fighting continues. We've been very fortunate in Judea and Samaria, crazy lucky with vehicle-borne IEDs. In military language, we call it VBIEDs, vehicle-borne IEDs, but basically bombs in cars that just by chance, alertness and speed of response of civilians and security personnel didn't result in dozens of casualties, Israeli casualties, but there's definitely worrying trends there. So wherever you look, there is definitely a lot to speak about and think about and be worried about, but there's also things to be hopeful for and things to take inspiration from, like the Goldberg-Polin family and many others.
The Goldberg-Polin family has been extraordinary throughout this whole horrific ordeal, and I hope and expect that they'll find the strength, summon the strength somehow to continue to rise as they have done. But there are, of course, 5 other families, and there's the whole country, and there are the families of hostages who remain in captivity. So when you use the word excruciating, I entirely agree, and it doesn't even begin to touch and describe the pain. One of the things that I wanted to address with you today is the PSYOPs, the psychological operations, that you and I have discussed quite a lot over the last almost year, unfortunately now. And I want to talk to you about the confusion because, as you know, I'm still tucked away here in cottage country north of Toronto in Canada and paying very close attention and very hardwired into what's going on. But that also means that I'm talking to a lot of people here. And there's tremendous confusion in North America, generally, in the general population, and also among the Jewish population, as to what is going on and why Israelis can't get their act together. So, people look at the government and they see, you won't do a ceasefire and this whole Philadelphia thing. And then they see these demonstrations, massive demonstrations in the street. Many Israeli commentators are going on television internationally and saying, wagging their fingers and saying, no, most people support Netanyahu's stance on the war. And then how do you explain this massive popular backlash that we're seeing in the streets? So I know that's a lot and it's messy, but try to summarize, because you're so good at this, best you can, what's going on in terms of the dynamic between the government and the people, between those who are saying, get the hostages back, even if it means pulling out of Philadelphi corridor, and then you have the government saying, what are you talking about, you leftist traitors? What's going on? Make sense of it all.
That is a tall order to try to explain and summarize. I'll give it my best shot. I was on I-24 2 days ago, together with Ambassador Michael Oren, and we spoke about roughly the same topic. I spoke about one aspect of it, and then he said that he assesses that the government suffers from a lack of credibility. The government and the prime minister suffers from a significant, acute, my words, lack of credibility, where people don't believe what the government is saying, and they don't trust the priorities and the management of the war. And I think that is reflected in media. It's reflected in numbers on the street, as you referred to. And I think it's reflected by lots of people voicing their concerns and their dissatisfaction with how the war is managed or how it isn't managed. Many things are extremely polarized and politicized, and even something that should be a relatively simple, like military issue, like the essence of the Philadelphi Corridor has become very politicized, and everybody's using it for their political gain. And I think that the most important thing to keep in mind when we speak about the corridor is that I listened carefully to the Prime Minister's remarks yesterday. In my mind, they were misleading because to control the Philadelphia corridor above ground, even the Rafah crossing, that's great and that's important. And that's one component. But not a word was said, unless I missed it, not a word was said about what needs to be done underground and what his plan is in order to stop the most significant part of what's happening in the Philadelphia area, and that's the underground tunnels. And if there's no plan to deal with the tunnels, then sitting atop or being positioned atop the Philadelphia corridor doesn't serve a lot of military purposes, because tunnels can be exited even if Israel places a mechanized division, an armored division along the corridor. And that's, for me, as somebody who looks at it from a basic military perspective, the way that we're talking about it, it's politicized, it's not professional, it's not grounded in facts and in real things that you can't really dispute, but it's very politicized and just used for political purposes. And to be frank, I said for so many months, and I explained to many people before the assault on Hamas in Rafah, I explained how important Rafah was, both in order to get hostages out and in order to cut the tunnels. I spoke about it myself and totally believe in it. We have to put things into perspective in terms of and consistency here in terms of the tunnel and sitting on top of Philadelphia. I think it's very dishonest to say now that the entire war was about the Philadelphia corridor. Had it been, of course, then that should have been the first place that we attacked, and that should have been front and center of our messaging and all our military and diplomatic efforts. And it wasn't. Philadelphia is important. The tunnels are very important, critical, strategic in order to stop Hamas from coming back, and Israel needs to deal with it. But I think that pitting hostages versus Philadelphia in a very narrow, short-term perspective is dishonest, misleading, and quite cruel, because what it does is that it makes the chances for getting hostages back very slim.
I just wanted, just for the benefit of our listeners, go back to Thursday night, last Thursday evening in Israel. There was a meeting of the Security Cabinet that became very heated. Of course, the transcript of the recording of the cabinet meeting was leaked, which in Israel, as you all know, our listeners, that it's a rare occasion when it's not leaked. So we have the recording of that meeting at which things became very stormy, to the point that Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant challenged Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he said, if you had to choose between controlling Philadelphia corridor and having a deal to release the hostages, what would you choose? And the Prime Minister answered Philadelphia. And they then went on to vote, and Minister Ron Dermer apparently said to Defense Minister Gallant, and I quote, "The Prime Minister can do whatever he wants." So this is the tone that the government is setting that to many Israelis is so problematic. And before we move on to another topic, I just want to make a couple of other points that I think are important about Philadelphia that you and I have been reiterating for months now. In addition to your comment that if Philadelphia was so critical to the war effort, would we not have gone in there, if not initially, then at least much sooner? Israel didn't go in until late May. It was May 20 or 21, I believe, when they first went into Philadelphia. For the last 2 months, we have had the 4 top security and defense officials. That would be the head of Mossad, head of Shin Bet, the Minister of Defense, and the Chief of Staff of the IDF. Those 4 individuals have publicly and consistently been saying, we do not need to control Philadelphia. We can take a 42-day break, get out as many hostages as possible. And if necessary, and we have to go back in, we can do it at a much lower cost and much more simply. Prime Minister Netanyahu and the military have known for a long time, as we've discussed previously, about the Philadelphia smuggling tunnels. It is not new. It was a critical part of Prime Minister Netanyahu's containment strategy, which was keep them happy, Let the Qataris bring in money. Let them have some arms. Let them feel big and strong. We'll let them into work in our agricultural communities in the South. But really, you know what? We got a nice status quo going. So that's known as the containment strategy, to be very brief about it. And this was part of the containment strategy, was allowing those tunnels. I just think it's important for people to realize that this isn't something that just popped up out of nowhere, the weapons tunnels. It was part of an ongoing strategy. But here we are, and we have our government putting its foot down and saying, we will not budge from Philadelphia. We will not move. And Hamas is saying, if you're going to stay there, then we're not going to release any hostages. There will be no deal. And then we have a horrific weekend or last few days, as we did, with the news of the murdered hostages after being in captivity, brutal captivity for so long, and then the reality of their funerals. And now Hamas, of course, leaking out in dribs and drabs, drip torture, videos, and information. And that's the psyops. That's the psychological ops that you commented earlier have actually been quite successful. But what do we do? And this is what people in North America ask, and in Europe, I'm sure too. What do Israelis do? They're seeing these videos. They know people are being tortured and killed and dying. They want them out. So how do they do that? They demonstrate. They protest. Are they playing into Hamas's hands?
So the short answer is yes. I'm not blaming anybody at all. They are. It is strengthening Hamas's hand. It is strengthening Hamas's position in the negotiations, and it is applying pressure on the Israeli government. I don't blame people at all, especially not families of hostages and loved ones. I don't know how I would act in such a situation, but I think that the short and honest answer to whether it strengthens Hamas's hand is yes. And nevertheless, it's a very logical, human, compassionate thing to do. When you see a wrong and you want to fight it, you do whatever you can in order to fight it. And whatever they can currently is to apply pressure on their government. And that is what they're doing. I'd say this, though. I think that what bothers me the most about this entire situation is that I haven't seen why is Yahya Sinwar capable of saying no, constantly saying no to American offers and to Egyptian mediation, and why isn't there a price to be paid, and why doesn't he feel the burn of the situation in Gaza? My assessment is that he isn't incentivized to cave in and to agree to returning the hostages because he and the Hamas leadership do not fear for their control over the Gaza Strip. And I don't think that Hamas are so deterred these days by if another Israeli division combat team goes in, operates in Khan Yunis or Rafah or Gaza City or one of the neighborhoods of Gaza City. That for sure isn't something that they want to, but they can lay low in their tunnels, hide behind their civilians, and they'll be more or less okay. What would challenge them and really cause them lots of fear would be if above ground they'd see a new alternate government taking shape, one that could challenge their control over the Gaza Strip and take them out of power. I don't see the state of Israel over the last 8-9 months focusing seriously on that, and I don't see any tangible results today. And I think that is the biggest thing that's missing when it comes to applying pressure on your enemy in negotiations. And we're failing in applying pressure on our enemy in these negotiations. The mantra was military pressure on Hamas will release hostages. And that's very debatable. I've said it myself a few times, but you can debate whether it withstands the test of time, and you can debate whether it was effective from the beginning. But I think we can all agree that now there's very little military pressure on Hamas, and there's no political pressure, direct or indirect. I don't see the Qataris being forced by the US to apply pressure on Hamas. I don't see the Egyptians applying pressure on Hamas. Again, there may be things happening that we are not aware of course, but I don't see that at least publicly, and that's not the tone that we see. And I see ourselves, Israel, being subjected to quite a lot of pressure, and I see tremendous pressure in Israeli society. And that's exactly the opposite of what we should be aspiring to achieve. We should be aspiring through diplomacy and leadership to have direct and indirect pressure on Hamas that forces them to negotiate and forces them to buckle under our demands, because we are winning this war and we should be dictating the terms. That isn't happening. And on the second level, we are not producing an alternative to Hamas in Gaza, and as such, not incentivizing them enough and not making them fear for their future. And as long as that's the case, I am, again, and this is what I started with, it doesn't instill me with a lot of optimism about getting live hostages back, because the incentive isn't there. And currently, Hamas has Israeli society and Israel as a whole probably just where they want us, through poor management by the Israeli government, through effective psychological warfare by Hamas, and through what I would say is very questionable support to Israel of our greatest allies and friends, who, instead of applying pressure on our enemy, are applying pressure on Israel.
In particular, President Biden, that was quite shocking, the comment that he came out with, whether or not Prime Minister Netanyahu has been, in his view, flexible enough in negotiations. A day or two after the murder of these 6 hostages, for President Biden to come out and criticize Prime Minister Netanyahu and not to, as you say, direct his criticism and pressure towards Hamas, Egypt, and Qatar is just surreal to me.
It's very disappointing. It was one of I saw the impromptu press conference, I think it was beside the presidential helicopter. The question was whether he felt that Netanyahu was doing enough and whether he felt that there would be a deal possible. And he responded, no, just one word. And out of that, lots of headlines. And it's part of that. I'm sure that was exactly what the journalist wanted to hear, to focus pressure on Israel, to single Israel out. And again, I'm not a spokesperson for Netanyahu, never was and never will be. And I think that he's definitely worthy, or he deserves a lot of criticism. But this isn't it. And first and foremost, we have to remember who we're dealing with. We're dealing with an ISIS-like organization, which is tremendously cruel, tormenting its captives and tormenting their families, and conducting the most cruel psychological warfare against Israel. So that, of course, is omitted from a lot of the reporting. And it is very disappointing that what President Biden said, and when I compare that to how he spoke and acted 11 months ago, when the war started, when Hamas attacked Israel, what a difference.
I agree. Jonathan Conricus, thank you so much, as always, for your time, insights.
Let's hope that next time we'll have something positive to speak about.
Let's hope so, eh? Thanks for listening. As you can see, we are working hard to keep you well informed throughout this difficult time. If you value our work, please consider supporting us with a paid subscription. We need the resources to get the job done. And to those of you already supporting State of Tel Aviv, thank you. My dedicated team and I are committed to bringing you the information, even when it is difficult to hear. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Yon Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager, who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.